and welcome back to Two Bi Guys. I'm Rob. I'm here today with a special guest who is in the LGBT plus charity space where bisexual people are often left behind, and we're going to talk about that today and how that plays out and what we can do about it. My guest today is Dominic Arnall. He is the CEO of Just Like Us, the LGBT plus young people's charity based in the UK. He is coming to us from across the pond, as some of our favorite guests do. He was previously the chair at Mind Out, a charity for LGBTQ mental health services, and also previously the head of projects and programs at Stonewall, a UK charity fighting for freedom and equality for the LGBTQ plus community. And he is pretty sure, quote, that he's the only bisexual man running an LGBT plus charity in the UK. At least that is what we messaged about. So I believe you. We'll talk about that. Welcome to Two Bi Guys, Dominic.
Oh, thank you very much. Certainly only out bisexual guy, I think.
Okay. Well, that's important. That is very important because, as we know from bi and visibility and erasure, if we're not out,
you never know,
then you don't know, and you often can't implement the things that might benefit the community. So I want to ask you all about that. I have many questions about that. But before we get into it, as we always do, I want to hear about you and your story and your bi journey. So first of all, what pronouns do you use, and how do you identify sexuality or any other spectrums you want to identify on?
So I use he and him, and I identify as a cis man, as a bi-cis man. Yeah, that's me.
Cool. So, sometimes that question is like half the episode, and then sometimes it's quite straightforward. So in terms of the bisexual identity, like, when did you first start to notice that in your life? And tell us about that journey and when you came out and all that.
I really like the framing of that question, I must say. When did you first start to notice that in your life? Because I think that very often I'm asked, when did you know you were bisexual? Which is such a complicated question because, well, what do you mean, when did I know the word bisexual? Or when did I use the word bisexual? Or when did I start having feelings? But I think to use your question, when did I notice? It would have been at school, I think primary school. I certainly had attractions to all sorts of people, and they weren't, necessarily kind of sexual attractions, but they were attractions, and they were people that I wanted to be with and spend time with. And I remember definitely at being very young and seeing there was a boy that I just sort of always wanted to play with and be near, even though I didn't really know him very well. And I think that sort of process has sort of carried on throughout my life, really. So it's just been a sense of knowing that my attraction is not limited to one gender, and sort of never has been. I think in terms of my bisexual journey, it's been, I was going to say it's been a bit unusual. Talking to bi people, it's often not that unusual, actually. But it feels unusual when you're talking outside bi conversations. So I came out about 15 to my parents. It didn't go very well, and resultingly I didn't tell anyone else for 3 or 4 years probably, so till I was 18, 19. And then I was sort of out to all my friends, and life took a few turns. I took a job, I was doing something else, I met someone, and suddenly I realized I sort of wasn't out anymore. So the new circle of friends I had were people that I knew through my partner. And, I started thinking, well, maybe I'm not that bisexual after all. Maybe this is my life now. Maybe this is who I am. And life kind of carried on like that for quite a while. And then when I was 35, I started working for an LGBT charity, and I still wasn't out. And I was very scared of coming out at an LGBT charity, possibly more scared than I would have been at a non-LGBT charity, actually. Particularly as when I came out at Stonewall, there weren't any bi men there, to my knowledge, or there weren't any bi men out there, I should say. It turned out there were bi men there. So
there always are, even
absolutely.
If you don't know. Yeah.
So I then kind of came out of work, And then I realized, oh my goodness, I've now got to tell my partner. And I don't want to go over too many of your questions here, but this is kind of my story, I guess. So I came out of work. I sort of started being progressively more and more out because none of my friends really knew. And what was
Mhm.
strange is my friends from way back home all knew. And I didn't really realize that I had been sort of leading this slightly strange life, existing in different ways in different spheres. And it almost happened without me recognizing it. Or I had just got so good at it that it didn't even occur to me.
Mhm.
And I sort of decided that I was going to be out in all spheres. I was going to be an out by man now. And so I wrote an article for The Independent, which is a newspaper we have in the UK. I was working for Stonewall, so I could do stuff like that. And I wrote it on a celebrity that had been sort of a gay man celebrity that had been really biphobic. And I wrote an article on why that was painful and why we need to be better on this as a community.
Mhm.
And it was really funny because the first thing that was happening in my mind was that I wasn't really worried about my friends because I'd now told my various groups of friends, I'd now told my partner. I was really worried about posting it on Facebook and having kids at school that I didn't really know that well suddenly find out I was bisexual. And I was
Mhm.
worried that they would think, oh, we always knew that. And that was painful to me for some reason. And I'm still not entirely sure why, but that's what I was trying to avoid all those years, I think.
Yeah.
That said, I've now been out for 6 or 7 years to absolutely everybody. Flags, pins, whatever I can get away with. And it's been great, and that's not to say that everyone's coming out story is great, because I think we've got to be really careful around those narratives. But for me, certainly, it's become something that, in contrast to me hiding it, has become incredibly important to me.
That's awesome. I have a few follow-up questions, but also we have a lot in common. I'm also out for about 6 or 7 years. So like something was in the air around 2015,
Yeah,
2015, 2016.
yeah.
Um,
Well, I just don't think there were that many bi people, And sorry, again, out.
yeah.
And I think that in all spheres there weren't that many bi people out, so there just wasn't the kind of scope for it a lot of the time. I mean, the reason that I came out at work was that someone said to me, "Have you ever been with a man?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, how can you call yourself straight then?" And I was like, "But." And I was in this awkward centrist space that we're familiar with, thinking, well,
Yeah.
what do I call myself? And he was saying, well, I'd use the word bisexual for that, rather
Yeah.
presumptuously, but also for me, true, because that bisexual has always been the thing that has felt true in all spaces. Whereas
Hmm.
all the other words, you can't really call yourself gay if you're married to a woman. You certainly can't call yourself straight if you've been with men before. So everything felt like it was kind of uneven and not quite a good fit. And that's why I
Right.
use the word. That's why I use the word to this day.
Cool. That's awesome. So many straight men do continue to use that word even when they're having sex with men, but
Right.
that's a topic for another
And,
time.
and
Or
well,
go ahead.
I think it's
No, go ahead.
I think it's a really important topic because certainly in the UK, there's been lots and lots of research that shows that particularly in the sort of young cohort, about 50%, it's a crazy high statistic of young people would consider themselves not totally straight and not totally gay.
Yeah.
Massive amount. And about 2% call themselves bisexual.
Yeah.
So we have a slight branding issue here. And I think that is fascinating, because most straight men that will say, or sorry, most gay men that will say they don't believe in bisexuality will have a great story about a straight guy they took home, right? So
Yep.
I think that, and it's true of my journey as well. I certainly didn't use that word for a long time, and I think that's really interesting.
It is. It's fascinating. It's something I'm always interested to talk about. But I also want to go back for a second and like, I think it's interesting. You said your story may be different than other bi people's, but actually not so much because I've heard so many times this idea of existing in different spaces in different ways. And even when you come out, that doesn't mean you're out to everyone. And
Right.
it's a constant decision when you're with in new spaces and with new groups of people. And I also like something no one's ever mentioned that I very much identified with when you said it was like when I started coming out, like, okay, the first few, it was kind of hard to do. I worked myself up to it. Then I went through a phase where I was like excited to tell people,
Yeah.
especially straight people, because I was like, guys, I figured something out that you guys don't know yet. And I was excited to kind of tell them after I broke the ice. But then I thought about like my old friends from high school or college, especially the ones who were queer themselves or gay themselves. And
Right.
I had this like anxiety about coming out to them because I thought, oh, they're going to say we already knew that. And like they're
Yeah.
going to be ahead of me. And like they
Right.
might have realized something about me that I should have realized before or could have. I mean, I certainly could have if I had the language and the knowledge. And so that you said you weren't quite sure why you had the anxiety, and I'm not quite sure either. But this is helping me realize like it might have been just some shame about not knowing it for myself
Yeah.
till my 30s.
Maybe you're right. I think there was two kinds. There was the shame at not knowing it, and then there was the fact that this had been used to bully me at school, right? Not being bi
Mm.
specifically, but being queer had been used to bully me at school. So the idea that under those circumstances it wouldn't have occurred to me just felt really silly.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah. And when you were 15 and you said you came out to your parents, did you use the word bi then? Did
I used the
you
word.
realize?
I used bi or bisexual. I can't remember, but
Wow.
I did
Yeah.
use the word, and I used the
Wow.
word because we. Do you know the band Placebo?
No.
So I don't know if they're quite big in the UK, but the singer is this bi man called Brian Molko, and he has like this awesome hair, and he was amazing. And I saw him singing, and I read him as gay, and someone said, no, he's bisexual. And I thought, that's what I am too.
Mm.
So I told people, I was like, oh, I'm like Brian Molko, right? that was my kind of my fit in. And I remember my dad sort of saying, look, everybody goes through things. Everybody has things happen to them. But you've got to decide what you want your life to be like. And I had, I know, right? And I had this sense I was at this fork in the road where I
Hmm.
got to choose like this right path or this wrong path. That's the image that I had in my head.
Hmm.
And to this day, I regret that I did that very literally. You know, I said, right, I'm going to date. I'm going to make the choice to date women.
Yeah.
And it's funny, you know, because it's not the most disastrous coming out story. I mean, I've heard worse. I've heard of people being kicked out of the house and all that, and that didn't happen to me. But it is amazing how in that moment you are so incredibly vulnerable and so sort of able to be influenced, you know.
Yeah.
And now part of our work when we get young people talking is we get them to tell their coming out story to groups of parents. And you can almost see these groups of parents who are at the first are thinking, well, I'm not LGBT, this has nothing to do with me. And then when the kids say, actually, this was what happened when I come out, you see these ears pricking up like, wait a minute. I should probably listen to this just in case.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I want to get into that more but in a minute, but it's also interesting. It's like some of the horror stories of coming out when people react really badly. It's like that is bad, but at least you know it's a bad reaction. And
Yeah.
sometimes when you get that middle of the road reaction, you don't even realize there's anything wrong with it. And you
Mm.
actually internalize the repression, you know,
I think
the,
that's really well
and
put.
so it can actually have a long-term effect, even if it doesn't seem as bad in the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, that's exactly what happened with me. Is that what I felt was a caring response.
Hmm.
So therefore, I felt that I should listen to it as one does with one's parents. And I wouldn't even say it wasn't a caring response, but it definitely wasn't the response that I needed to live as me.
Hmm. Yeah. You mentioned your partner.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how did you meet her and how did your sexuality affect your partnership or your marriage? And like when, what was coming out to her like?
So we were set up on a blind date in London, and we turned up and we just sort of got on very well straight away, and that was 8 years ago now. So we were just sort of talking and talking, and it just sort of went very well. And I can't remember, which sounds ridiculous, but exactly when. I would imagine we'd been together about a year. That's roughly right. And I came home and I sort of said, I've got something to say, that I thought bisexuality was this, but it turns out that it's actually more like this.
Uh-huh.
And that's probably a bit more like me.
Hmm.
And then, of course, that was sort of fine. I think the more difficult bit was then I was working for an LGBT organization and I was a bi man. So then I was writing about it and I was talking about it. And I think we did go through a bit of a moment where she was trying to work out, well, why has this not come up before? Why has this sort of suddenly come up? Has something happened? Has it been precipitated by an event that and that's why you're sharing it? And that wasn't the case. I mean, other than the event of someone at work just telling me a little bit more about it. So, but I mean, since then she's been absolutely fantastic. I think there's something unique about being bi, and that you have to coming out to your partner is a bi and a trans experience.
Yeah.
It's not something that if you're gay or you're lesbian you'll go through,
Right.
as is coming out to your partner's parents. All these like little interesting things
Yeah.
that you kind of go through. And for me, it just became quite important to tell people, because I'd spent so long not telling anyone. So I became
Yeah.
like Mr. Bi Guy for a while, like just talking about it as often as I could.
Same. I went through that period. I may still be in that period.
Well, yeah, me too.
When you told your wife like you thought bisexuality was this thing, but actually it's this. Do you remember what you actually were thinking and what you said?
Well, I remember what I must have said, because this is what I had thought, is that I had sort of thought that being bi was a kind of, you know, I sort of thought that being married meant that I wasn't bi anymore. That's what I had in my head. Being in this long term
Mm-hmm.
relationship,
Mm-hmm.
having been with a woman for so long, I suppose I viewed being bi as behavioural rather than it being something that was part of me.
Uh-huh.
And I think that that's where I got it wrong. And that's where, when I had the conversation at work and they said, well, no, it's not straight, is it? And I was sort of thinking, well, no, maybe this box does fit me the best. I mean, it's funny because, it's just never been very simple with me. I've never felt a really clear cut, that's definitely me. I've come to really love the term bi or bisexual, because it just sort of fits me the best, and it's not a lie, and and it
Uh-huh.
encompasses sort of all of me.
Your
But yeah,
sexuality is complex and not simple. What?
isn't
I've
it?
never heard that before. That's crazy.
Well, and I think it's interesting because so much of their narratives by LGBT organisations and LGBT people, to a degree, focus on this sense of being sure and being certain, and there being a moment,
Yeah.
you being miserable, there being a moment, and everything being fine. And that's not my story. And actually, the more and more people I meet, that story doesn't encompass all of our communities at all. Sometimes it can be a bit more complex than that.
Yeah, exactly. I do I do think there's so many people in marriages who think, oh, if I come out, that means something's going to change in the
Oh
relationship
yeah,
or the structure of it will change, or we'll have to have an open relationship.
right.
But many people actually remain monogamous, and still being out to their partner is important because it's your personal identity is important, not
Absolutely.
because you need to be polyamorous necessarily.
No, exactly. And of course, I think for some people, polyamory is the answer. I think for me, being in a monogamous relationship was fine, and I didn't want that to change.
Yeah.
I wanted to be heard, and I didn't want to lie about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It felt like an expression of honesty to me.
It's so funny how to many people, straight people, that might not make sense, but like of course it makes sense. Of course, like it is possible to love your wife and love your marriage and want to
Mm,
be monogamous, and also not want to lie to your wife
yeah.
about this important thing every day. Like of course that's possible, and yet many people will say, well, why would you bring it up? And they don't get it. And so thank you for sharing that and putting it that way. And now a word from our podcast hosting service and sponsor for this episode, Zencastr. Now, I know how challenging remote podcasting can be. I basically figured it all out myself in the first year of the pandemic, and there are many, many things to think of when you're going from start to finish, from recording to syncing up with guests, to editing, to post-production, to downloading and uploading, and everything in between. That's why after that first season during the pandemic, I switched to Zencastr, and I chose them because I thought they were the best quality recording service. They record audio locally and then sync it up with each other so that each person's side sounds clean. And now Zencastr also distributes podcasts, so not only do they do the recording part the best, but they can help you streamline everything from start to finish. Plus, now, in addition to studio quality recording sound, Zencastr records video up to 4K and will distribute your video podcast in 1080p to all available video podcast players. You can also now add your own custom watermark to those videos, which we have started doing, maybe you've noticed. Zencastr is all about making your podcasting experience easy. And with everything from local recording to automatic post-productions right in the tool, you don't have to leave your browser to get the episode done. So I highly recommend Zencastr. And now if you go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my code 2ByGuys1, that's TWOBIGUIS, the number 1, you'll get 30% off your first 3 months of Zencastr Professional. I want you to have the same easy experience as I do for all my podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story with Zencastr. Let's get into your work and your charity work, and let's talk about LGBT youth. So first of all, tell us a little about Just Like Us. What is it? Why was it created, and how did you get involved, and what do you do there?
So essentially, over the last 30 years in the UK, the LGBT community, certainly in legislative terms, has taken some pretty huge steps forward. So, we've got equal marriage. We've got, you're able to serve in the armed forces, which you weren't. You're able to adopt. Same-sex couples are able to access fertility treatment. And there were lots and lots of changes that happened very quickly, which led to ILGA, which is a membership organisation for LGBT organisations, saying, well, the UK is the best place in the world to be LGBT. And that's quite a high accolade, and it's quite interesting, I think, because the experience of lots of people I knew at school wasn't really living up to that. And of course, it makes sense if you think about it, that it doesn't matter if you're at school and you're being bullied, and you're being bullied to the extent that you can't face it anymore. The fact that you might be able to get married one day or that you might be able to adopt, it just sort of couldn't be less important. You're trying to get through the day. So Just Like Us was formed really to improve the experiences of LGBT plus young people. And not by doing lessons to straight people saying, this is what a lesbian is, this is what a gay person is, but really bringing the stories to life of LGBT plus people throughout history, throughout culture, throughout science, and giving schools a complete curriculum that matched their key stages, all the years at school, to really allow them to deliver LGBT inclusive content, whatever it is that they teach.
Cool.
And one of the programs we do is we have the ambassador program. So we train 18 to 25-year-old volunteers to speak in schools, workplaces, and the media about their experiences as LGBT plus people.
Cool. That's awesome. What kinds of trends are you seeing lately with LGBT youth? Like, how has it changed over the course of time that you've been at Just Like Us?
Well, I think when I started in the sector, which was in 2015, there was a real sense of progress, like things were just sort of marching onward, and it felt like things would just continue to get better and better. I must say, despite that, there was still very little bi visibility at that time, very little. And I think that, and I know that you've seen some of this in the States as well, there's been a bit of a disruption, to say the least, to that progress. And now it's starting to look like actually we're going the other direction, and the experience, particularly of transgender young people, is getting incredibly difficult. Not that it wasn't always difficult, but I would say it's getting worse, because there's a feeling in the media, certainly, that this is a hot topic. Every prime ministerial candidate, we've got an election going at the moment, is being asked what is a woman, as they're sort of, and this is despite, all sorts of issues, there being a war in Europe. This is the number one issue, apparently, that our candidates must discuss.
Yeah.
So it's become incredibly difficult over the time I've been in the sector to be an LGBT plus young people person. And I think one of the differences people don't realize is that there are schools doing brilliant work. There are schools we work with that are incredible, but there are still schools doing absolutely nothing. There are still schools that refuse to do anything, refuse to provide support. Will talk to the schools about, all the old religious evils, etc. And we believe certainly that we don't believe, that schools need to know absolutely everything, but we think it's right that students know about the existence of LGBT plus people, and they know that being LGBT plus is okay. Because if you don't know about the existence of LGBT plus people, and you are LGBT plus, then you grow up, as so many of us did, thinking you're the only person in the world that has ever gone through this. That's an enormous burden to put on young people. So that's what we're trying to change.
That's awesome. Yeah. Really, for kids, it's like, if you don't know this stuff exists, how can you even
Exactly.
connect it to yourself, or you just feel so alone? And that's what me too. Like, I had all these thoughts and I just assumed no one else thinks this. And
Yeah,
so I'm not going to think it either. And I just kind of pushed it away.
exactly.
But like you said, though, with like trans and non-binary kids, and gender fluid, gender queer, gender non-conforming, this is sort of the most targeted group right now over there, and definitely over here. It's like a political lightning rod, unfortunately. How do you guys address gender and trans youth? And like, do bisexual people are overrepresented among trans and non-binary people?
Absolutely.
There's a lot of crossover.
Absolutely. And, I'm always saying this when we talk about LGBT people and trans people, like with two completely different groups of people. It's not true. There are lesbian trans people, there are gay trans people. But there does seem, certainly in my circles, to be an overwhelming number of bi trans people.
Mhm.
And that plays out in our research as well, an awful lot of trans people. And I wonder if there's something about looking at your identity in depth, which we all have to do as LGBT plus people, that makes you kind of consider yourself in a way that other people don't. That's just a guess.
Yeah.
But I think that, bi people are trans people are bi people. And we've always had that kind of sharedness in the community. And I think that when the major LGBT organisations, certainly in the UK, were ignoring trans people, of course they were also ignoring bi people. So we've also had that kind of shared feeling of being the kind of outsider queers as well.
Uh-huh. Do you see like a shift in the number of, you mentioned a statistic earlier, but like in the actual work you're doing, do you see more kids identifying as any of the LGBT letters? Is there a particular letter or letters that is increasing more at the moment, or?
So all of the LGBT letters are increasing in proportion to kids that identify as straight. But bi kids particularly, I'm happy to say that there are more kids that feel comfortable with IDing as bi, certainly in our research, than there have ever been before.
Hmm.
Which is phenomenal, because I think that in schools, if what it means is that kids are hearing the word bisexual, they're kind of understanding the term and they're relating the term to their own lives in a way that I think took me rather a long time to do. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, kids today are having this wonderful thing where they're able to say who they are, and they won't take no for an answer,
Yeah.
And it's just the most wonderful thing to see kids of that age so confident and so able, so articulate in speaking their truth. It's wonderful.
It is amazing. Like, I want to see what the kids who are lucky enough to grow up somewhere where it's accepted and visible, what's that going to be like when they become
Wow.
adults? Because like you and I were doing cool stuff, but we were both pretty, me more than you, but we were both not at the level some of these kids are at today with the
Sure.
comfort at such a young age. So
Yeah.
it makes me hopeful.
Really makes me hopeful too. And what I hope is that I think that certainly in the LGBT community, there are certain people of, my generation, um, who kind of are trying to like pull the ladder up a bit, and who are sort of saying, well, I'm gay, but all this stuff with gender is ridiculous or whatever. And I think that is really something that all of us need to watch, because we were at the other end of that, and we should remember that. We shouldn't allow ourselves to have such short memories. And what I hope for the kids that are growing up today is that they get a sense of that as well. They remember that when they get older, there will be things, which you and I haven't heard of, that they haven't heard of yet.
Right.
There will be new things that neither of us know. And I hope that they embrace them, and they remember the discrimination that they faced. As I hope for all of our community, actually.
Right. Me too. Something I'm noticing, I'm curious if you have too, is like with young people especially, and even some people in their 30s around my age, is like they don't necessarily want to identify as bi. Maybe it's our branding issue, maybe it's like stigma, but they will say stuff like, well, but I'm not straight either, and I have no label, or I am whatever I want to be today. So it's this like a fluid identity, but they don't want to assign a specific label to it. Are you seeing more of that? And like, if you are, how do you target a group like that for these kind of resources?
So funnily enough, yes, particularly in that kind of 30 plus category you talked about, I think that's quite common. And the kind of who cares, I'm just me thing seems to be like a phase people go through later on in life, where they start to think that maybe labels don't matter at all, and maybe we can all just, it's a sort of slightly utopian vision, isn't it?
Right. I want that someday, but I'm not sure I'm there yet.
It would be wonderful, but I don't think any of us are there. I don't think society's there.
Yeah.
And certainly the support structures aren't in place for young people that want to grow up, because they can't be whatever they want. They will soon realize that people who reflect their identity aren't represented in books and aren't represented on the television, and people will tell them that who they are is wrong. So they will then have to go through this process of reclaiming this identity again. And I think in that environment, saying, well, I'm just me, is fine if that's your story, but it's also a reflection of the kind of slightly more privileged position you found yourself in. And it's not a position that is available to everyone.
Yeah, well said. That's a interesting perspective on that. I agree. And now a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. When I was first recognizing my bisexuality and coming to terms with it, I thought it was something I would take to the grave and never tell anyone. I was very stuck focusing on problems instead of solutions. I was very wrapped up in fear of what would happen if I came out. And I was not really thinking of all the joy and positive changes that would come from coming out. One of the things that really changed things for me was therapy and finding a therapist. It's helped me to stop focusing on those fears, and it's helped me to be more authentic, get in touch with my feelings, speak my truth, and relate and communicate better with other people. There's this perception that if you see a therapist, it means something's, quote, wrong. I totally disagree. I think everyone can benefit from talk therapy. So if you are thinking of giving therapy a try, BetterHelp is a great option. Full disclosure, I have not tried BetterHelp myself. I already have a therapist for many years who I love, but BetterHelp is great for many people. It's convenient, it's accessible, it's affordable, and it's entirely online. When you go to BetterHelp.com, you get matched with a therapist after filling out a brief survey, and you can switch therapists anytime. When you want to be a better problem solver, therapy can get you there. Visit betterhelp.com/2biguys today to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/2biguys. Let's talk a little about like in the charity space in general. So like something we hear a lot is that bisexual people receive like something like less than 2% of the resources that go to LGBT plus groups, very little funding, very little things specifically targeted for the B in LGBT. So like we hear that a lot, but I'm curious, how do you actually see that playing out? Is that actually a big deal, or are the other resources helping bi people? Let's start there. I mean, this is a
Oh,
big
do you
big
know, that's
topic.
a really big question. It's a difficult one. Are the resources helping bi people? Well, sometimes, I guess, is the answer. I think generally an acceptance of more queer people is helping bi people. It's good that bi people are able to get married in same-sex relationships. So it's a little of each. The progress has helped. I think the trouble is that in a kind of slightly trickle down way, it was expected at some point. It seems like that's all bi people needed is to have those kind of crumbs from the table. And that isn't and has never been true. And there are a great many bi-specific issues. And sometimes it can be categorized as, well, where are our bars? And I'm thinking, well, certainly in the UK, our border control has turned back bi people to countries where they can be killed on the basis that they can just be with, well, can't just be with the other gender. And of course, huge disparities in sexual health, huge disparities in mental health, certainly substance abuse, drug misuse. And I'm not, of course, suggesting this is all bi people, but certainly it seems to be more prevalent with bi people, everything that I've just said. So there are huge issues that need to be tackled that aren't being tackled a lot of the time, I would say, by mainstream LGBT organizations. I'm lucky being bi myself that obviously this is important to me and I'm able to keep an eye. But then I think something that is really important is who is in that organization.
Yeah.
So for me, I think about a quarter of our staff are bi, which means that, if you need to call someone for a case study, you can probably work that out. It means that your first thought isn't necessarily going to be a gay man or a lesbian. And it means that you kind of probably understand these issues in a little more depth. So when someone's talking about something that's not sexual orientation, like mental health, you're going to be thinking, well, of course, that's very prevalent with the bi community in a way that perhaps you're not if you're not part of the bi community. So we do a number of things that are specifically aimed at bi people, and we make sure that our LGBT resources are inclusive of bi people and that we're talking about bisexuality as a spectrum and all that sort of thing all the time. It's some of the stuff that's got the best response is that we do these media pieces, because although you hear about LGBT in the media, a lot of it's negative or a lot of it's focused on adults. So we get the voices of young LGBT people to speak in the press about something they really love. So you'll have like a bi person that's like 18 saying, I really love Brooklyn Nine-Nine. This is why it meant a lot to me. And that's the kind of stuff that we want young people to find when they're searching, about being bi, about their identity. We want them to find like bi people talking about cool shows they like, stuff that they can get into. And that's what we're trying to create at the moment.
Yeah. Focus on the positive and like the joyful aspects of it for kids is
Oh,
probably a
goodness.
good
I
thing.
mean, at the moment, so particularly in the UK, I don't know if this is true in the US, but LGBT charities talk about suicide a lot.
Hmm.
They talk about self-harm a lot, and there are reasons for doing that, which I understand. But we just have to be very careful about what we're telling kids about themselves. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, for me, no one should be walking into a school saying LGBT people are 4 times as likely to attempt suicide. It's a really dangerous thing to do. And actually, we're
Hmm.
duty bound to tell some of those great stories from our community so people know that actually being LGBT can be really great.
That's really interesting. I never really thought about that, how tricky that can be in that space. So, like, I'm curious if you could expand a little. Like, we know that mental health outcomes are worse for bisexual people than straight, gay, lesbian. We know that physical health outcomes are often worse as well. Like, how do you, as a charity, address that without always talking about the negative and the downsides? How do you balance that?
Well, firstly, I think it's important who you're talking to, because I think we, like all charities, can be a bit guilty of you get your speech, the thing that you say, and then you go out and you sort of say it at everyone.
Mhm.
Whereas actually who you're talking to is very important. So for me, if you're talking to young people, you should be telling them where to get support with their mental health, absolutely. Signposting them to resources, but we don't need to do a kind of a pitch for money, for example, which might focus on the negative, or a pitch for support, which you might do to teachers. You might say, look, this is why it's important that you're supporting bisexual young people specifically, because actually the mental health rates are worse, for example. And that's an appropriate message when you're trying to drum up support, whether that's financial support or whether it's making sure that an institution is doing its job. Personally, I don't think it's an appropriate message for young people. I think the message for young people should be that you can live a wonderful life, that there is a community there waiting for you. And if you need help, that help is available, and here it is.
Interesting. Yeah, I was gonna ask, you kind of answered this, but let me throw it at you again. Like, how does your bisexuality affect the work you do at Just Like Us or other work you've done? It sounds like there's like an intangible thing that makes a lot of sense to me of just like you'll be looking at the issue a little differently, and you may think of something that a gay or lesbian person might not even realize, to phrase something a certain way. Is it mostly that kind of X factor, or are there other things too?
I think it is that, because I think that diversity, and this is true of other diversity strands as well. When you're doing something on behalf of someone, it's never going to be quite as good as if you've got the right people in the room. And I think that's the case for all diversity work, and biodiversity work is a part of that. But I think there's also, when you're in a space that has had a lack of bi people, and certainly leadership of LGBT charities in the UK, and from what I understand, pretty similarly in the UK, in the US, bi communities have been extremely critical, rightly so, of LGBT charities, who have ignored them, made jokes sometimes, used the words gay and lesbian as a synonym for LGBT, used homophobic without mentioning biphobic, the sort of whole nine yards. And that's happened for a really long time. And because of that, I think bi people in the UK can be quite critical, quite cynical of LGBT plus charities. And I don't think that they're wrong, I should say. But it's nice to be a bi man that's out as a bi man running an LGBT charity, because I hope that does something to soften that as well. I hope that I can show that we're doing good work, and they know that I'm coming from a really authentic place.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. It seems like when bi people are invisible at the top of organizations like yours, then we're just bound to be erased in a trickle down way. But when you've got somebody, with this stuff in mind, then you just kind of that trickles down as well, and we're part of the conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not uncommon, certainly not so much nowadays, because the community has done a great job of calling them out on it. But it used to not be that uncommon in the UK to have a list of, say, 100 LGBT athletes or 100 great LGBT leaders, and there wouldn't be a single bi person on the list. That happened a number of times. Because LGBT, you can keep adding letters, but unless you're actually planning to do some of the work that underpins that and understand the needs of those groups, then really you're still just saying lesbian and gay.
Right. Here's a random question. Let's say you were hired by, the UK government to sort of correct the bi erasure in the charity space, and they gave you all the resources you asked for. What would you target? What do you think to help the bi and trans communities, really sort of the most targeted? Like, where would you focus on? What do you think are the biggest things that we're lacking at the moment?
So you know what? Firstly, I would fund bi groups, bi specific groups. So despite working for an LGBT charity, I would say that we have to do our bit and we have to be inclusive. But the situation in the UK is that bi work isn't funded at all. So you've got big LGBT groups that are going through a journey of bi inclusion. But I don't think that would ever be enough, actually. I think however good we are, there are specific needs of the bi community that LGBT charities aren't set up to address. So I think that the correct funding, and there are some absolutely brilliant ones we have here in the UK. We have Biscuit, which is a resource for bi women.
Oh, yeah.
We have the Bisexual Index, run by Marcus Morgan, which is fantastic. And I think that these are the sorts of groups that we need to make sure that we're funding. Bi Pride in the UK, to make sure that bi people are having their needs addressed specifically as well as generally.
Yeah. I love that because I'm part of a couple bi organizations and we have very little money and
Right.
we could do a lot. Like we have the sort of infrastructure built already to do stuff for the bi community. There's only so much we can do with
Of course.
basically no budget.
I think, and bi organizations have been doing a lot on very little for a long time. So they can
Yeah.
be incredibly resourceful.
Yeah.
And that's good and it's bad. It's good because it means that at such a time when bi organizations are being funded, and certainly the LGBT consortium in the UK has undertaken a review and is looking specifically at how you can get money to bi organizations, which is
Yeah.
great. And what really struck me when I looked at the findings of that review is how little they wanted. Like, we're not talking about millions and millions of pounds here. It was just so very reasonable. So I think for me, that's the most urgent thing, actually, because those same bi organisations have really good connections with the community and are really well placed to do the work. They just need the money.
Yep. Agree. Okay. Give us money. So I found an article where you were interviewed and you were talking about coming out in the workplace, which I think is a big topic for bi people. We talked about it last season. It's like it's one of those, even if you're out to your friends or family, it's another big decision to come out at work or not. If you're bi, you don't necessarily need to, but then, I'm curious, like, why do you think it's especially hard for bi people to come out in the workplace? What was it like for you? Do you have any advice for people who might be out in other spheres but are not out at work?
So it's difficult me speaking on this because I've worked for LGBT organisations for a while, and there's certainly the perception that it would be easier to be out at an LGBT organisation. I don't know if this is part of the question. That hasn't always been true, and I've absolutely experienced biphobia working for LGBT organisations at LGBT conferences. But I think that because of that, it's slightly difficult to talk about being out at work in non-LGBT environments because I never was. Mm-hmm. And I regret that a bit. I feel like but I think this is the problem as a bi person. You're not sure if you're safe to be out. And then if you're not out, you feel desperately guilty that you took that decision.
Yeah.
I worked for a mental health organisation after I worked for Stonewall, and I decided that I was going to be sort of fully out to everyone there. And it was sort of fine. I think there was, if anything, there was a bit of a sort of, there was a bit of a feeling like, oh, is that it? Are they, are people not more interested or bothered? And I was lucky that they weren't. But I don't know that the NGO sector is typically representative of most places in the UK, but that was my experience.
Cool. Okay, and then finally, I wanted to ask you about another piece you wrote that I thought was great. You wrote a piece in Pink News about how becoming a bisexual dad means that you feel you need to speak out even louder for the sake of of our children. So I'm curious if you could tell us a little, like, what has the experience of becoming a bisexual dad been like, and how has it affected your sense of identity or your bi identity or otherwise?
When I wrote that article, I was, I think my child was about 2 weeks old, and I was, so I was sleep deprived, and I was incredibly anxious about almost everything. And yet, my identity kept kind of playing on my mind. And I think that I was worried that people would think that it was weird. I was worried that my daughter would feel, some way about it when she got older, that all this sort of stuff started flashing up. And I think as is so often the case, I kind of came to the conclusion that a lot of it was projection. A lot of it was things that I'd felt about myself at various parts of my life that I didn't want to face, that suddenly sprang up when I had a daughter, like sprang up and hit me in the face, big time. Mm-hmm. And I think that I really wanted to just talk about it. Do you know, out of everything I've written, that is the article that most people have talked to me about. Because I think being out at work, coming out as a father, there's something that feels a bit unsafe about that,
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
and I wanted to make sure that people knew that we can have whatever we want, and in my case it was a child, and we can be parents, and actually a lot of us are parents,
Yeah.
but certainly when I was looking, there weren't many bi male role models that, when I was looking around, and no one was talking about the fact they had kids. And I thought, actually, that's an important thing for people to realize. We've always, of
Right.
course, got one eye on young people. And I think when I told someone, and I remember their response to me was that I asked them if they were going to come out to their parents, and they said no. Grandchildren have always been really important to my parents, and I couldn't tell them I'm bi on that basis. And I remember thinking, well, that's unusual because, whoever you end up with now in the UK, you can have kids.
Hmm.
But I thought, I didn't think she was wrong. I think she was still right, because there's some sort of setting that kicks off in parents to say, my child is LGBT. Does that mean, they're going to lead a certain life, and I'm not going to have children?
Right.
So I think for all LGBT people, that, yes, we can have children, it is really, really important.
Yeah.
And I think particularly in the bisexual space, just because I hadn't seen it before.
That was the first line of questioning from my parents when I came out to them, was all about, do I still want kids or
Right.
not? So even though to me I was like, why are you asking that? That's not what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. It is for a certain generation, or maybe for straight couples, like that's very tied together. Yeah, I just really love that the part of the article where you talked about how, like, the fatherhood identity, at least 2 weeks in, was really consuming all
Yeah.
your other aspects of your identity, and your bi identity almost like faded at that
Yeah.
time because you were so focused on this kid. And I'm curious, like, how that's evolved
Yeah.
over time.
I think there were two reasons for that. One was that I wasn't working. So, because I was on parental leave, I wasn't engaging with LGBT stuff every day the way that I would if I was at work. And the second one is that those early weeks as a parent were, for me, the most terrifying time of my life. There were, to have a baby that was my responsibility, essentially to keep alive in those early stages, was incredibly scary. And that sort of fear, that sort of, I have to make this work, took over absolutely everything. I'm pleased to report that feeling probably lasted about 8 weeks. And then you find the rest of your kind of personality starts to come back. Maybe not completely, but in dribs and drabs over the next year.
Cool.
And since then it's been really important to me to sort of recognize that all sorts of people can be parents, and to make sure that when we're talking to parents, we're talking about the fact their kids could be LGBT, and how would they respond if that happened. Because I think if you can just set that thought in motion,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people that I speak to, when they told their parents ended up being fine, but they weren't fine right away. And there's this kind of cliche with LGBT people where you say, well, you've had X long time to get used to it. They've just had to get used to it in an instant. Right. And, you think, well, fair enough, but maybe they could do a little more thinking in advance about what if their kids are LGBT and how would they respond. And actually, I think probably the world would be a much better place if they did. So we try and start that journey a bit early.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know. Hopefully more people are imagining that possibility, because the odds of it happening are
going up all the time.
Increasing. Yeah. I also thought it was kind of sweet in the piece that you were nervous about the future conversation with your child and coming out to them. And I just thought to myself, like, I understand that anxiety and where it comes from, but if he can articulate all this now in this article, I'm pretty sure he'll be fine when that conversation comes up by that time.
I had some people message me and say very similar things. I had some other bi dads message me, which was really great, and sort of just say, look, you forget, don't you? The problem isn't children. The problem is the wider world. Children are enormously
Right.
accepting. And of course, no
Right.
one should know that better than me in my work.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
Children are always accepting of difference, actually, is my experience. The only time is when they've been taught not to be.
Right.
So, and hopefully that won't happen, because obviously we're parents. So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, if you can sort of set containers and safe spaces and normalize queerness from a young age, both as a parent and, in schools and in through the charity work, like the rest may hopefully fall together naturally, and there will just be less shame and repression and stigma and bullying to begin with
mm.
if you establish these
I,
norms early.
I think so. I think, the thing of doing the gay lesson, as I said earlier, the thing of saying, right, well, this is who we are, even pride, really, these are, for me, transitional stages going towards a future where people don't feel like they have to jump from one thing to the other. People can feel that they can come out at their pace to who they want to. They can be who they want to in all walks of their life, but not like they're keeping a secret. Like that's who they are.
Yeah.
And I think for bi people, that jacket sometimes fits a little better than this, right? You wear this, now you're this.
Yeah, interesting. Cool. Well, thank you so much for being here, Dominic. This has been a fascinating conversation. You can follow Dominic on Twitter at Dominic Arnall, and you can support Just Like Us at www.justlikeus.org. So thanks so much for being here on Two Bi Guys. It was great to have you.
Oh, thank you. I follow the podcast, so it's been a real pleasure to be on.
Two Bi Guys is produced and edited by me, Rob Cohen, and it was created by me and Alex Boyd. Our logo art is by Caitlin Weinman. Our music is by Ross Mincer. We are supported by the Gotham, and we are part of the Zencastr Creator Network. Use promo code 2BiGuys to get 30% off your first 3 months of Zencastr. Thanks for listening to Two Bi Guys.